Hello everyone. Today we are going to be talking about our second last kingdom, Kingdom Plantae. Before we get there, we are going to be talking a little bit about plants and how they evolved to be what we see them as today. We have a few learning goals in mind for today, one of which is to be able to explain the benefits of the evolutionary adaptations that we've seen in plants. You should also know the 4 different sort of types of plants and characteristics of them and some example organisms. You should be able to explain alternation of generation in relation to some of the different types of plants we're going to be talking about and how that alternation of generation may differ between them. Of course, you will need to know the basic characteristics of Kingdom Plantae and also know some of the interactions of plants with the organisms around them, other species within an ecosystem, because those interactions are very important for the ecosystem as a whole. Okay, so this first part is all about how did we get from here to here. And so on the left over here, do you recognize what that is, where you might find it? Well, that's actually algae. And so how did we get from algae, our often unicellular organisms, to big, beautiful, luscious trees? How did we get there? And that's what we're going to try and answer. And the answer to this question really reads like a story. Once upon a time, we had this primordial soup, which is just, aqueous solution of compounds that accumulated and eventually gave rise to our first cell, our first living creature. Now, all life began in water. All life on Earth began in the water. And somehow, over time, we left the water. Plants are no exception to that. So there are some risks in terms of shifting to land. Some of the risks are the harsh environment. It's harsh because at the time, the Earth's atmosphere had not, it didn't look like what we know it as today. And so today's atmosphere has lots of gases that help protect us from the sun's harmful ultraviolet rays. But without that protective atmosphere, it's a very harsh environment. So UV rays can damage organisms. There was a lot of heat. And as a result, these organisms can dry out. And, if you lose water, you cannot function. So there's a lot of risks. But to plants, there was also a lot of reward, primarily in the form of opportunity. If plants were to leave the water and shift to land, there would be lots of carbon dioxide. So the atmosphere that did exist had lots of carbon dioxide. There was also tons of sunlight. So these photosynthetic organisms would have access to tons of sunlight in order to thrive. And there were very few competitors or herbivores. So there would be nothing to eat them, basically, and nothing to outcompete them in terms of access to nutrients, sunlight, water, carbon dioxide, whatever they were going for. And so by plants shifting to land, it paved the way for all other organisms to also exist on land. And so one thing that I think is really interesting is, why didn't the plants shift earlier? Why didn't they go onto land earlier? And I mentioned Earth's atmosphere and how those UV rays would be damaging. Well, one thing is that water helps to filter that, so they were protected in the water. But the other thing is that atmosphere that later developed was a result of photosynthetic bacteria. And so these photosynthetic bacteria were actually releasing oxygen into the atmosphere, and this allowed the ozone layer to be created. So, there is a hypothesis that green algae are the closest evolutionary relatives of land plants. So green algae, if you recall, those are protists, and you will see either older classification models or different classification models that actually put green algae under kingdom Plantae, but we're going to stick to protists. Now, there's some evidence that leads us to believe that these green algae are the closest evolutionary relationships to land, or relatives to land plants. And the first one is presence of chlorophyll A and B. So both green algae and land plants will typically have chlorophyll A and B. Now, chlorophyll is the pigment inside chloroplasts, which of course is responsible for performing photosynthesis. And so they have both types of chlorophyll. It's just a molecule, and A and B is a sort of different versions of the same molecule. So not only do they have the presence of the same pigment chlorophyll, but the chloroplasts themselves have a similar structure. They are sort of formed, the structure is comparable. Similarly, there is cellulose in the cell walls of the cells. So the cell wall of the plants have cellulose, as do the cell walls of the green algae. Both of these types of organisms will store food in the form of starch. And so starch is a polysaccharide, which just means it is a chain of sugars linked together. And so, for example, potatoes, you may have heard, have a lot of starch. And the reason being is that they are storing that food. That's where that food is being stored. And finally, there are just similarities in the genetic code. So what their DNA actually looks like. Now, as far as answering the question of, how did they get from the water to the land? It's believed that these ancestral green algae, or charophytes, would live in shallow water, and the shallow water would sometimes dry out. Now, I want you to try and answer this question. How would this situation have led to plants on land? I want you to think about what you know about evolution and natural selection. Pause the video, give it a think. Okay, hopefully you pause the video and have come to some sort of idea. Now, what researchers believe to have had happened is that some of these ancestral charophytes, or green algae, over time acquired the ability to survive droughts for longer periods of time. And so if certain organisms are able to survive droughts, then they're going to survive and be able to reproduce. Whereas some other organisms are going to not be able to survive and not be able to reproduce. And so over time, what likely would have happened, we would have had this sort of natural selection towards the green algae that is able to survive. And further selection would have resulted in our earliest plants. Okay, before we go on to talk about some of our earliest plants, we need to talk about where they came from. Now, you may remember this, but green algae, or charophytes, live in the water. So if they live in the water, then they're going to be obtaining their nutrients from the water. Any water, any gases, any whatever. All of the nutrients that they need to survive are in the water, and that's what they're doing, where they're getting it from. But their weight is also supported by the water. So any mass they have to them, they're just floating along in the water. So it's supported by the water. And the water is also really important for allowing their spores to access other organisms or of the species and to reproduce. So everything is in the water is allowing this algae to live. So with all that in mind, there are a number of challenges to living on land. Algae receive their nutrients from the water. If something is going to survive on land, they're going to be getting it from the soil. And the question is, how? How do you get it from the soil? So this is relevant with the minerals, as well as how are the plants going to be getting their water? And we mentioned that it was going to be hot. And so as a result of that, there's going to be a susceptibility to desiccation, which just means drying out. So how are plants going to survive when there's a possibility of drying out? Now, the sun is going to be coming from above, which, there are some benefits to that. But again, there's that risk of drying out. And in addition to that, there's the question of, well, if I'm performing photosynthesis high up, how am I going to move the products of photosynthesis, glucose, around the body of the organism? So how am I going to transport anything? And there's also the question of weight. What will support the weight of the plants? Because, the atmosphere isn't going to be able to support that like water does for the algae, which means there's going to need to be some sort of support structure. And in addition to that, there's no water for the sperm or spores to swim around in. So how are these plants going to be able to reproduce? So these are all challenges to living on land that plants were able to overcome with time. And they've done it in a number of different ways, depending on sort of what plant it is. So earlier we talked about those changes that would have occurred to the charophytes to allow them to survive for longer periods of drought. And so some of those adaptations as a result of genetic diversity would have been things like waxy cuticles. So waxy cuticles is a layer around the epithelial tissue, so the outside, that would allow it to help trap water and prevent the plant from drying out. Another possible adaptation that would have occurred was in organisms that protected their embryo. So remember, their embryo would be sort of the reproductive component. And so these embryos were protected in tissues, which meant they wouldn't be drying out, they would be able to go on and reproduce. And as a result of some of these adaptations, these changes, over time, we got our plants from these charophytes. Okay, what we have here is a little phylogenetic tree. Now, as you may or may not recall, a phylogenetic tree shows us the evolutionary relationship between organisms. So on the left here, we have our ancestral green algae. So these are the oldest over here. And you can see two types of plants. So finally, we're getting into kingdom Plantae. Generally, there are those that are non-vascular and there are those that are vascular. For now, we need to describe the word vascular. Vascular is basically, or vascularization is sort of the transport system of the plant. You can compare it to the circulatory system in humans and some of the other, animals and things like that. That's basically what it does. It moves nutrients around. So we have plants that have a transport system, that do not have a transport system, and we have plants that do have a transport system. And so when we're classifying kingdom Plantae, we can place them into four groups. First is our non-vascular plants, and this group consists of mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. Under our sort of vascular umbrella term, we have our vascular plants with no seeds. And so they have spores instead. And an example of that is the fern. So that's a plant you should be fairly familiar with. Under vascular, we also have our seed plants, so plants that produce seeds. And there are two types of seed vascular plants. We have our conifers, which produce cones, so things like pine trees. And we have our flowering plants, which, they make flowers. So we are going to be getting into each of these 4 different types of plants. But before we do that, I want you to take a minute and brainstorm all the reasons that plants are important. Because as we go along, we will be talking about some of these reasons. But you know what? You know a lot about plants already. You've grown up with plants. So take a moment and just check in with the knowledge you already have. Okay, hopefully you paused the video. I'm sure you thought of lots of different things, including food, obviously. Oxygen produces oxygen, the foundation of ecosystems, maybe building materials, habitats. We'll get into all that fun stuff later, though. Now, like I said, you know plants pretty well, probably, but here are their general characteristics. They're multicellular eukaryotes. Should be no surprise to you. They photosynthesize, so they're autotrophs. They're sessile, which means they can't move around much. And they have a cell wall made of cellulose, which is different, you may recall, from fungi, because fungi have a cell wall made out of chitin. Plants will live in all aquatic and terrestrial habitats, except maybe at the poles. They are the main source of oxygen for the planet, followed only maybe by cyanobacteria. And they are the base of every food chain or food web, which means where you get plants, you will get other organisms. Another important thing about plants is that they have a life cycle called alternation of generation. The last time we talked about it, or the first time, may have been when we were talking about the alternation of generations of brown algae, the protist. It seems pretty fitting that the next time we're talking about it in terms of plants. Now, alternation of generation just means that there is a life cycle that has both a diploid and haploid state. If you recall, just as a reminder, diploid means that it's a cell or organism that has 2 sets of chromosomes, one from each parent. Whereas haploid means that there's just one single copy of each chromosome. So in humans, most of our cells are diploid because we have one set of chromosomes from mom and one set of chromosomes from dad. But our sex cells, so our eggs and sperm, are haploid. They have one set of chromosomes. And then when that egg and sperm fuse, it will become diploid. When we are talking about plants, when they're in their diploid phase, they produce spores. And so for this reason, they're called sporophytes. And when the plant is in its haploid stage, they are going to be producing gametes. And so they're called gametophytes. So on the screen, we have two different life cycles. Over here we have our animal life cycle, and on the right we have our plant life cycle. Now, of course, humans are animals. So this is the life cycle that you should be most familiar with. Basically, diploid, which means both chromosomes from mom and dad, is the majority of the life cycle. And certain parts of our body can undergo meiosis, which results in sex cells, so our eggs and sperm. When these sex cells fertilize with another sex cell, they will become a zygote, and, we get a happy little human. And the process repeats itself. Basically, we have a diploid individual that will be producing haploid sex cells. And it repeats. Now, just visually, looking at the plant life cycle, we see that it spends time in both diploid and haploid. When in the diploid stage, so that's up here in green, the organism is going to be producing spores. And in the haploid stage, it's going to be the gametophyte, that's what it's called, up here in red, will be producing gametes or sex cells, which will then fuse, and the cycle repeats itself. We'll get into that in more detail with specific organisms. Now, just as a reminder, because we're about to get into it, we have 4 classification groups of plants. The first one is our bryophytes. So those guys are non-vascular and seedless. And our bryophytes are composed of our mosses. As we move up our evolutionary timescale, we have our pteridophytes. Right here are pteridophytes. And so they're going to be our first vascular plants, but they're still seedless. Next up, we have our gymnosperms. And our happy little gymnosperms are also vascular, but this time they have seeds. And our final plant is the angiosperm. And our angiosperms also are vascular, and they also have seeds, but they look a bit different. And so you may notice that angiosperms have enclosed seeds and gymnosperms have non-enclosed seeds, and we'll get into what that looks like later. First up in our tour of Kingdom Plantae are the non-vascular plants, or mosses. Some examples of these vascular plants are the mosses, hornworts, and liverworts. Now, all of these plants have a few common characteristics. They're small, like they're short, they don't get tall. There's no true leaves, stems, or roots. And that kind of explains their size. There's no structural system to help them get tall. So they're small. And because there's no vascular tissue, so they don't have that transport system, they're going to be living in primarily moist and damp areas because they rely on diffusion to help move the materials around the plant. These non-vascular plants are the simplest of land plants. They're the first land plants. They have that protective cuticle to help retain water. And like I said, they don't have any roots, so they have something root-like called rhizomes. Now, these are non-vascular plants, but they also don't have seeds. So they have swimming sperm called antheridia or antheridium. And because these sperm swim, well, they need to live in areas that are very wet. Now, if we take a look at the alternation of generation of a moss or a gametophyte, sorry, not a gametophyte, a bryophyte, we can see that the yellow is a bit larger than the blue. So the gametophyte generation is more dominant. That's where the mosses spend most of their time. So why don't we start over here on the left with our mature gametophyte? And that's typically what you would recognize when you see a moss. Now, because we're a gametophyte, we're going to be producing gametes, which means male sperm and female eggs. Now, you may notice that the male and female gametes are actually coming from the same plant, which means it can self-fertilize. But anyhow, so we have our eggs, the egg gamete and the sperm gamete. And when these gametes meet, they can fertilize, and you will end up with a young sporophyte, which is 2N. So 2N means it's diploid. So it has one set of chromosomes from dad and one set of chromosomes from mom. In this case, it just so happens that they might be from the same plant. This moss, which is now in its sporophyte generation, will produce this big long stalk. And this stalk at the top will be a sporangium. So the sporangium creates spores. The spores are haploid, so they're half, and we repeat the process. The spores will then germinate, produce a moss that is in the gametophyte generation, and we repeat. So gametophytes produce gametes in the form of sperm and eggs, and sporophytes produce spores. And recall that because this is a moss, it requires swimming sperm. So this would still need to be in a moist environment in order to create our young sporophyte. Now, in terms of non-vascular plants, we have a few different types, including bryophytes, hepatophytes, and anthocerophytes. All of these are, short, flat plants, with the mosses being the most recognizable to you. And mosses grow everywhere. They're very successful organisms, and so you find them everywhere. And there's actually tons and tons of different moss species. Now, if we take a look at the images, they're probably a little bit more familiar to you. So over here we have our mosses. What happy little soft mosses. And here we have our liverworts. And so a lot of liverworts have leafy-like structures, but remember they're not true leaves. And they're going to be living in our tropical forests and other humid climates. Now, the liverworts, you may notice I say that, they all sort of have these leaf-like structures. But you notice that the hornworts are, if we're looking at this phylogenetic tree, are most closely related to our vascular plants. So I mentioned earlier what vascular tissue was. It's our transport system in the plant. And so it brings things up and down. We'll get into the different types of vascular tissue later in our plants unit. But what you need to know is that it's going to transport things like water, minerals, and nutrients, like glucose. And this vascular tissue is important because it means that we can grow bigger and taller and have specialized tissues. Now, like I mentioned, our first land plants were small, simple. They didn't have any vascular tissue. Eventually, over time, they evolved into vascular plants. Vascular tissue allowed for the evolution of roots. So, because we now have vascular tissue, we can now have roots. And roots do a few different things for plants. They allow anchoring, so plants can now dig deep into the earth in order to grow up. Roots, of course, are really important in absorbing water. These root systems can now access water from places further away, which also means that plants can now survive in environments that are drier. So we have our vascular tissue, we have our roots, and we also have leaves. And leaves were really important because it increases the surface area, which means plants have better access to sunlight coming in. And leaves are also the place of gas exchange, which means oxygen can leave the plant and the plant can accept carbon dioxide. So we're growing in terms of surface area as well. And as we all know, surface area is key for so many things in organisms. Now, plants also developed something called lignin, and lignin helps to strengthen the vascular tissue and allow for a support system for the plant, which means that plants can grow taller. And if you can be taller, then you have better access to light. If you can grow above the other plants, then you're going to be accessing that sunlight. And if these plants get these sort of positive attributes, then they're going to be happier and they're going to be more able to reproduce. And so their progeny, their offspring, will also have these attributes. And with the evolution of this vascular tissue, the roots and the leaves, so many problems were solved in terms of the challenges to moving onto land, including roots are able to help store water in case of drought. The support structure of this lignin and vascular tissue can help support larger plant structures in the atmosphere. And because of this vascularization, there was also a transport system now so that plants could also get bigger. And so what ended up happening is these things grew huge. And so after having introduced the idea of vascular tissues, I hope that I have you, on the edge of your seat waiting to hear about our next evolution of plants. But I am going to leave it here for today. We will pick back up tomorrow with our 3 different groups of vascular tissue type plants. What I'm going to do is I'm going to post 1 or 2 links below, one of which is a video that's going to talk about how plants actually caused the first mass extinction on Earth. So that's all for now. If you have any questions, let me know, and good luck.